Imagine a fortress. But actually, scratch that. We're not talking about a castle on a hill here. We're talking about an entire nation surrounded by churning oceans, with its gates heavily fortified, barred, and completely sealed shut against the outside world. For over 2 centuries, the Tokugawa shogunate engineered one of the most absolute policies of national isolation in human history. They locked the door to an entire country, creating an airtight seal against the explosive forces of global colonialism. Today, in this explainer, we are investigating the mechanics, the motives, and the ultimate violent shattering of that seal.
Okay, let's dive into this. Sakoku. It literally translates to locked country. This was a severe, completely uncompromising foreign policy enacted by the Japanese government, the Baku, between 1633 and 1639. And the reality of this policy was absolute. It strictly controlled all foreign trade, prohibited Japanese citizens from leaving the country on pain of death, and basically banned almost all foreign nationals from ever stepping foot on Japanese soil. So, to break all this down, we've structured our historical investigation into 5 parts. We'll start with the reality of the Tokugawa locked country, uncover the motives for absolute isolation, examine the strictly controlled 4 gateways, witness the arrival of the black ships, and finally, look at the geopolitical whiplash of the Meiji pivot. Let's get into it.
Chapter 1: The Tokugawa, Locked Country. Now, to understand why a nation locks its doors, we really first have to understand what it's protecting inside, right? The Sakoku policy wasn't just some random political whim. It was the bedrock of an era known as Pax Tokugawa. By severing ties with the unpredictable outside world, the shogunate managed to maintain over 2 centuries of unbroken, unprecedented domestic peace. During this time, a highly distinct, refined national culture flourished in absolute safety. And honestly, perhaps most importantly, while European colonial expansion was violently redrawing the maps of Asia and the Americas, Japan remained totally untouched. It was a sovereign fortress completely insulated from the colonial feeding frenzy.
Chapter 2: Motives for Absolute Isolation. So, what drives a powerful military government to such extremes of paranoia? What were the security dilemmas that made the shogunate decide to just pull up the national drawbridge? Well, the answer begins with a massive number: 300,000. That's the estimated number of Japanese citizens who had been converted to Catholicism by Spanish and Portuguese missionaries. And we're not just talking about peasant converts here. They included powerful southern feudal lords, known as daimyo. To the shogunate, these Jesuit and Franciscan missionaries were definitely not harmless priests. They were seen as the vanguard of an existential threat. And this brilliantly illustrates the shogunate's ultimate nightmare. They were trying to balance the requirement for absolute, unquestioning domestic control against the core tenet of Catholicism, which is a supreme, unyielding loyalty to a foreign entity, the Pope in Rome. The shogunate viewed this foreign religion basically as a 5th column. It was a direct ideological competitor that could fracture the absolute loyalty they needed to keep the nation from plunging right back into civil war. And you know what? That paranoia was violently validated between 1637 and 1638 during the Shimabara Rebellion. This was a massive, bloody uprising primarily composed of Christian peasants and masterless samurai, known as ronin. For the shogunate, this was the terrifying proof they needed. Foreign religion was no longer just a spiritual issue. It was a potent, destabilizing weapon that could literally be leveraged to overthrow Tokugawa rule. They realized they had to act, and act fast. To secure the fortress, the shogunate issued a series of brutal edicts, culminating in 1639. Step 1. A strict travel ban forbidding Japanese citizens from leaving. Step 2. The absolute death penalty for any citizen caught returning from abroad. And Step 3. A complete ban on the construction of ocean-going vessels. They limited ships to small coastal designs that literally couldn't cross oceans. But this wasn't just about keeping ideas out. By funneling all contact through the capital, the shogun ensured that rival regional lords couldn't trade independently to amass wealth, gunpowder, or European firearms. The lockdown was total.
Chapter 3: The 4 Gateways.
Because, well, the reality is the country wasn't 100% sealed. It was more like heavily filtered. Think of these gateways kind of like airlocks in a giant spaceship. Japan had exactly 4 tightly regulated corridors for interaction. Down in Kyushu, Nagasaki handled the Dutch and Chinese. Tsushima Island managed relations with the Joseon Kingdom in Korea. The Satsuma domain in the south dealt with the Ryukyu Kingdom, and the Matsume domain in Hokkaido traded with the Ainu people. Everything was categorized, controlled, and contained strictly within these airlocks. Now, what's really fascinating here is the sheer scale of this containment. Take Dijima, for example. It was a tiny, fan-shaped artificial island built directly into Nagasaki harbor. This tiny speck of land was the absolute sole gateway for European trade. The Dutch traders who lived there were heavily guarded. They were restricted from crossing that single bridge into the mainland without express permission, which effectively made them highly profitable prisoners.
You might be wondering, why were the Dutch allowed to stay when the Spanish and Portuguese were violently kicked out? Simply put, the Dutch were Protestants who were strictly interested in profit, not missionary conversion. But the shogun demanded a really high price for this monopoly. In exchange for market access, the Dutch had to provide regular global intelligence reports, known as fusacho. This created a whole phenomenon called Ringaku, or Dutch studies. It gave the isolated leaders in Edo a private, highly controlled window into the rapid technological progress happening in the West, all without exposing their own populace to it.
Chapter 4. Arrival of the Black Ships.
For 200 years, the locked door held, but eventually the insulated wood of the fortress met the iron and steam of the industrial age. By the mid-19th century, the macroeconomic reality of the globe had shifted completely. Western industrial powers were expanding aggressively across the Pacific. They desperately needed refueling ports for their new steamships. They needed safe harbors to support their massive North Pacific whaling fleets. And they needed efficient trade routes across the ocean to the incredibly lucrative markets of China. A locked and uncooperative Japan was simply a geographical obstacle that the West was, frankly, no longer willing to tolerate.
Which brings us to a massively faithful moment. July 8, 1853. U.S. Commodore Matthew C. Perry sails 4 massive steam warships, which the Japanese called the Black Ships because of the dark smoke billowing from their stacks, straight into Tokyo Bay. He completely and deliberately ignored the centuries-old Japanese laws demanding that all foreign vessels route strictly to the airlock at Nagasaki. It was a terrifying, in-your-face display of industrial might right on the shogun's doorstep.
This was literally the ultimate expression of gunboat diplomacy. Commodore Perry delivered a letter from U.S. President Millard Fillmore demanding open ports, trade access, and protection for shipwrecked sailors. And the brutal ultimatum attached to this? Perry promised to return the following year for his answer, bringing with him a much larger, much more heavily armed fleet. The shogunate, armed with feudal-era weaponry, looked at the modern naval artillery staring them down and realized the fortress had been severely outmatched.
Chapter 5. The Meiji Pivot. When the gates were finally forced open, the resulting shockwaves fundamentally rewrote global history. Let's move to the timeline and see how this builds, because the domino effect is just staggering. Perry arrives in 1853. By 1854, realizing their military inferiority, the shogunate signs the Convention of Kanagawa, officially opening ports to American ships. This humiliating concession shatters the entire illusion of Tokugawa power. The domestic peace shatters right along with it. And just 14 years later, in 1868, the entire 250-year-old shogunate collapses internally, sparking the Meiji Restoration. So what is the macro takeaway here? What is the real so what of the Sakoku policy's end? Well, the forced opening obviously exposed a severe military vulnerability, but Japan didn't suffer the fate of its neighbors. To avoid European colonization, the new Meiji government essentially harnessed the tightly organized society built during those 200 years of isolation and unleashed it. Over the next 3 decades, Japan achieved a rate of rapid, breathless industrialization never before seen. They pivoted from a feudal, locked country into a terrifying global industrial and military superpower by the early 20th century. It is for sure one of the most massive historical whiplashes on record.
Which leaves us staring down a pretty profound historical dilemma. Look at the arc of the Tokugawa shogunate. They successfully kept the peace and preserved their culture for over 2 centuries, which is incredible. But by stopping the clock on their own society, they basically allowed the outside world to lap them in technology and firepower. So I'll leave you with this to ponder. Does true isolation actually protect a nation, or does it merely delay the inevitable, ensuring that when the door is finally kicked in, the shock is absolute?